you're not going to lose your job to AI. You're going to lose your job to a developer who uses AI. Are companies going to start having? Are they going to have to start
Human airtime.
Yeah,
and then
humans.
AI,
Humans have to create a certain percentage of content. I don't know.
AI generated songs playing on the radio.
Things like that. Like, how much has to be made by a human? Yeah.
So hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of my podcast. Today I'm joined by Bert Ong, who is a software engineer at Microsoft. So welcome Bert to the podcast.
Hi, thanks. Great to be here.
So in this podcast, we'll get some advice from Bert on how you can get tech jobs, what skills are most important as a software engineer when you're working at big tech companies. And we will also talk about some other juicy goodness as well on AI and some other stuff. So I'll link everything and I'll have timestamps in the description below. So I guess, Bert, we can start off. You can tell the people what you do.
Okay, so as said, my name is Bert. I am a software engineer here at Microsoft. I work on the Azure Communication Services product, and we've had a reorg recently, so my role has shifted. I was at the Azure Enterprise Promises team. The goal is we are working on enabling our service to be used by enterprise customers to deliver a set of features that are required before they can even use us for various reasons, such as regulatory or compliance requirements.
Okay. Well, I guess now let's talk a bit about, you can briefly explain to the audience. It's a general team you work in, so ACS, Azure Communication Services. What's that about?
So Azure Communication Services is a communication platform as a service. CPaaS is the fancy acronym these days. What does that mean? The way I'll explain it is, it is a product that enables developers to build communication solutions using the back-end services that power Microsoft Teams and Skype. So it provides an API, and I believe the business model is you create a resource in Azure and we charge per use. And the reason this is useful is because Microsoft has spent a long time building up this backend for Skype and Teams over a long period of time, because in addition to when you do your Teams calls, like setting up the video calling for the meetings, we also had to set up chat. We also had to set up integration with actual telecommunications networks, because you can send SMSs through this and also make phone calls with it. So that's a lot to build by yourself. So by allowing our customers to use this, we believe we can provide them a lot of value.
So I guess that's ACS at a high level. So now let's focus on your journey. Yeah. So you can talk about how you got to Microsoft.
Oh, wow. So I've been at Microsoft for 2 years. But I guess we can start at the beginning. So
maybe let's start. So let's do this chronologically. So you can start off. So you graduated from university. So now what happened?
I did a computer science degree at UBC, University of British Columbia. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
So I did a bachelor's of computer a bachelor's of science in computer science at University of British Columbia. Originally, actually, I was not in a computer science major. I was actually in a major called COGS, Cognitive Systems, which is an interdisciplinary major. It was a combination of computer science, linguistics, philosophy, and psychology. But it was after doing some co-op work terms while I was a student that I decided that I actually wanted to focus more on computer science. And the reason for that was the COGS degree was absolutely fascinating. But I found that a lot of it was preparing, at least I felt it was preparing students for going into research, into grad school. And that wasn't something that actually really appealed to me, especially after doing my internships. I think my first internship was at SAP. And getting to actually work on building software that customers would use, that felt to me far more interesting than academia. And so I switched into a degree because I felt I wanted to specialize and go into the industry after I graduated. Not saying that you can't do that with COGS, by the way. There are plenty of talented COGS majors who have found their place in the industry. But for me, doing the upper level courses as we are getting more and more into research, I wasn't personally interested. And so I wanted to focus more on, the more technical portions. So after I graduated, I was actually unemployed for probably a year or so at least. part of that was I had some struggles with interviewing. I remember I interviewed at Amazon, for instance, right after I graduated, and I flew down, and I was nervous. And looking back on that interview, there's so much I did wrong because I think I was focused so much on thinking about what I thought they wanted instead of presenting, I guess, myself as a candidate and what I had, that it just really wasn't a good fit. So my first job after I graduated was actually at a small software consultancy. So the business model for this is I wasn't a consultant. It was more that I was a contractor. I worked full-time for this company, had benefits, but this company would go out to other clients. For example, it's been like 10 years. It's been more, for example, an American company called Shutterfly was one of my clients, and I would work as a contractor for them through this consultancy company.
And then the work would be like software engineering?
Yeah, it was software development. And so I was there for about maybe, I think, 3.5 years. And I remember and I left that job. And one of the reasons I chose to leave was because I felt that I wasn't growing in my role. So the thing I liked about, I guess, what I really liked about the idea of working at a consultancy was the ability, especially early stage in career, to work on various projects. So out the gate, I remember working on an Android project. And at the time, that was like super cool to me because I'd never done anything mobile. But then the way it works with consultancies, though, is that it's based on what your clients need. And when I graduated, this was a time when the industry was transitioning to HTML5 for their web UIs. So previously, companies had used maybe various different technologies to write web UIs. One of them in particular was Adobe Flex. If you're not familiar with Adobe Flex, it was a platform built on top of Adobe Flash to create rich web experiences. So Flash was more like for the animator side, and Flex is more of a framework built on top of Flash to provide more of a rich web interface. And this fell out of favor for two reasons. One was HTML5 becoming more robust and mature, and the other reason being Apple choosing no longer to support Flash on their iPhones. But the reason I bring this up is because our clients, they had built their website, back in the day in Flex because it was the best technology at the time, and they were in the process of migrating over to HTML5. But instead of, letting us as a consultant work on the fun, cool HTML5 project, I ended up being saddled with maintaining this older legacy Flex code base, which wasn't great for my own morale because, I'm working with something that I know is actively going to be deprecated soon.
Sorry to cut you off.
No worries.
No, I was just going to say, so like technical revolution, that was a big part in your career development
feeling
as well.
Like I was becoming technically irrelevant. The second part was also a lack of growth mindset amongst my peers. Like, I'm using the term growth mindset. As someone who works at Microsoft, it's something we value highly. But this is before I, had heard the term growth mindset. It was something I kind of implicitly valued. So what had happened is I remember talking to a dev there who'd been there maybe 10 years longer than me, a bit older. And I was chatting. We were working on the same project. And I had reviewed some code that he had checked in. And we were building off... At this point, I was no longer working on Flex. I was working on something that involved a web API. But he was writing something that... he was pretty much unfamiliar with the concept of a REST API. And they weren't anything new at the time. And the fact that I'm someone who's much junior and understood that, and I mentioned, hey, why are you using this HTTP verb on this check-in? If you look at the pattern that we've been using throughout here, you are putting like all this stuff in a GET request when really it should be a POST request with this. And he was surprised at that. And then that's when I was like, oh, wait, how much do people actually develop and grow at this company? And that's when I realized, unfortunately, not so much. So I ended up leaving that job, resigning. The other part actually was a friend of mine who'd worked there had also been laid off like maybe a few months before. And part of the reason he got laid off was also he had increasingly become dissatisfied with his job, his lack of growth, and that reflected in poor performance. And I noticed that my performance, I think, was also dropping.
So just the company culture also.
Yeah, it just didn't really contribute to that. And so I personally was like, you know what? I don't want them to fire me. I am going to quit on my own terms and figure out what I want to do. And so then I spent some time reevaluating. And actually, that same friend who got laid off was how I got my next job, which was at... it was actually at General Electric.
Oh, wow.
It was a big step up.
But I think that period, that's a super scary period, like when you resign a job.
Yeah. I'm pretty lucky in that regards, in that I have very good familial support. So obviously, you know, if you... not everyone is, I guess, necessarily as in a position to take advantage of that, but I was able to. And I was able to take time to figure out what I wanted. So we'll get to the second job after, I guess. So General Electric... what actually happened was the friend of mine who had been laid off and started working at General Electric, he actually didn't start working at General Electric. He started working at a company called BitStew, and it was a startup in Burnaby. What happened was they got acquired by General Electric. At the time, it was one of the biggest startup acquisitions, I believe, in Canada.
And when is this? Sorry?
This was around 2016, I think, 2015, 2016.
Okay, so not that long.
Yeah.
2015.
So this is a very, but this is considered like, you know, a very big acquisition. And this was part of General Electric's push into digital industrial transformation. They had formed, GE is a huge old company, and they had formed this whole digital division, GE Digital. And at this time, they had been going around trying to expand the company, and one of the ways they were doing it was by buying up startups. So I think I was actually employee like number 3 or something at post acquisition. And so they got acquired, they got some budget, and they started trying to increase their headcount to grow their product. So I was there for about I think 2 years, 2.5 years, I can't remember exactly, but it was around that time. And and then unfortunately they shut the office down, and out of the 70 people at that office, only 7 kept their jobs, and I was not one of them. I think this was back in 2019.
Okay.
Yeah.
You can just bring the mic a bit closer.
Sorry.
You can just bring it closer to yourself. Yeah. But I guess that's similar to what's happening right now as well with tech layoffs. I guess we can talk about that in a bit more later on.
So a little bit. So I can talk a bit more about what happened there in terms of the strategy. There's actually a book called there's literally a book called Lights Out, which is about how GE unfortunately has got into the situation it's in. This is written by journalists. I've read it. It's a fascinating read. This is not specifically about GE Digital. It's about GE as a whole, but GE Digital, I think, suffered as part of the company culture from a larger... this is a casualty of this larger entity.
And so was it after this GM that you got into Microsoft? Yeah.
So, before that, so this was 2019, I ended up getting a consulting role, contract role, at SAP after GE. And that went on, and my contract was up for renewal in March of 2020, which that's a date that might stick in a lot of people's minds. So I was actually, I had actually wanted a full-time job at SAP. I had actually had a really good experience there as an intern. And at the time when I applied for SAP, the only position they had available there was this contract position. So I took it, and the idea was after 6 months, I would find a way to pivot that into a full-time role. Unfortunately, COVID happened. And so I think early on in the pandemic, I think there was initial... I think SAP also had a bit of a CEO change, so some internal stuff. So my contract was not extended, and I think there might have been some kind of soft hiring freezes, so it was a little tougher. So I ended up back on the job search during lockdowns. And it was, during this time when I ended up applying to Microsoft. And it actually worked out really well for me because that's, that it was in the fall of 2020 when I got my offer from Microsoft and signed and joined ACS.
Yeah. And I think for your job at Microsoft, just the accumulation of experiences at so many different companies that you've had, I think that has, also been a major part. Actually,
I do think so. Looking back on everything, it's actually quite serendipitous how things worked out. So, one of the things that I actually was worried about on my resume as I got to Microsoft and I was applying was I looked through my resume and, I've worked for this long. and I'm not a specialist in anything. I'm a generalist still. And I'm like, this contributed to a lot of anxiety, right? I'm like, wait, like people have been working longer. They've developed like really strong skill sets in certain programming languages in certain areas. And I'm kind of this person who's kind of worked all over. For instance, at GE, we worked on some proprietary technology, which was based on Java, but you didn't write it in Java. You almost wrote it in XML. It was weird. So I transferred off that team and tried to go more into DevOps, discovering I wasn't the biggest fan of doing DevOps as a full-time thing. And so, when I got to Microsoft, I was like, well, what do I say? What do I do? But then I also realized, I was like, what is my strength? And I was like, my strength is I'm actually able to adapt really quickly to change.
Yeah, I was just going to say that because I think this is also a super big topic in the tech industry.
Yeah.
Is for people who manage to get into the industry, like, what do you do? Do you stay in one thing, or do you try to amass like as many different like platform knowledge and like be a generalist?
Yeah.
But I think being a generalist, the pro is that you are able to adapt.
Yeah.
But I think the disadvantage is that you don't have a specialty in something, so you can't really like truly excel, like if you compare performance.
Yeah, and I would say that a generalist is actually good for like an early career, early to mid-career. But in your mid-career, that's where I think it's a good time to start pivoting into trying to develop technical depth and becoming a subject matter expert, which is what I'm actively working on right now. But that said, very serendipitously, like, the way I talked about it, I was also like, viewing things, and it had actually become my own worldview that being able to adapt for technologies and not being stuck on one thing was a strength. And so in my Microsoft interview, I talked about that without having even realized that this was Microsoft's big cultural change in 2016 when Satya became, was it 2016? But when around that, when Satya became CEO and started pitching the new Microsoft, I didn't realize this actually. I had actually kind of lost touch about what was going on with Microsoft since then. I didn't, like, it was actually like right after my interview loop, I was, after I got my offer, I was super excited and I felt pretty confident. Like after the interview loop, got my offer, was really excited. And it was during like my onboarding when we were doing the training and started talking about the growth mindset. Suddenly I was like, oh, wow. It's like I walked into the interview and had a checklist already of all the things they wanted to say, and I didn't even have that checklist. I just said it because this was like
this was personal experience.
This is actually what my personal experiences had led me to. Like this time off, this jumping between roles, it had led me to this position.
A bit more detail into that with like your time off and you applying, looking for jobs, is how did you manage to like secure these interviews? Like what were some of the things when you look back now? Like what are some of the important skills that some other people who want to get interviews, like what things should they focus on to get the spotlight?
And I would say it really depends on where you are in your career, because there are two parts to the interview process, right? There's the part about getting your resume noticed, and then there's the actual interview loop. And one of the really hard parts, I think, is actually getting your foot in the door, getting your resume noticed. Yeah. And I think this is somewhere where I feel like I have, I was very lucky to have big name companies on my resume, and also a school such as UBC, which is has some international recognition. So the fact that my resume, I had SAP internships, I had General Electric. And then later I had, some SAP contract work. These are all really helpful. That doesn't necessarily help someone who's early in career, though, right? Yeah. So if we want to talk about, that's the thing. Like when you're saying like, what type of advice do you want to give someone to get noticed? I think it does depend where you are early in career.
So like someone who just recently graduated, like they don't have any experience.
So that's a really tough one these days. So a bit of background is when I entered computer science at UBC, it was 2005. And there was still the aftershock of the .com implosion. Facebook was really just starting to take off, but I don't think, obviously some people knew, but I don't think the idea of how good the tech industry wasn't quite as ubiquitous as it is now. Like I knew people who switched to major in computer science because their grades were too low to go to med school. Their grades were too low to get into biochem and chem. But my understanding now is at UBC, it's one of the most competitive majors to get into right now.
Yes. I can attest to that.
Yeah.
As
So-
a UBC student.
Yeah, it's a very different world. But back then, like,
It was like on the rise.
yeah,
so.
but like, so I feel like I got lucky going in at the right time. But getting into co-op back then, you didn't need, like, what do you need now? Like a 90 average?
Yeah, well, it's your grade as well as like you need like acceptance from a company because there's so many
To even
people
get into the
applying.
co-op program.
Well, to get into the co-op, you can like get into. So this is my like I've never been through the co-op.
Okay.
So, but this is just my understanding so far. Like, there's the co-op program from the university.
Yeah.
But then you actually have to get placement into a company.
Yeah, that's the same process. But
Mhm.
like, to even get into the program, you need like to maintain
Mhm.
some kind of average.
Yeah, I would guess so, probably, because just from the sheer amount of people that
Yeah.
there are. trying to
And
do the
it
same.
was, back then it was easier to do that. And nowadays, like I said, it's so competitive. Everyone's like, I feel like there's so many more opportunities. Like, you have hackathons people can attend.
Mhm.
I think it's almost at this point expected that you do an internship. So I think a lot of these days, the new crop of, I guess, the new batch of graduates are going to have at least a little bit of internship or project or hackathon experiences. For someone who doesn't have any industry experience because they weren't able to do a co-op program, or maybe only realized later in their journey that this was the thing they wanted, I think the advice I would give there is hackathons are probably your best way to do that.
Mhm.
There's a lot of really cool skills you can develop at a hackathon, and if you have a really cool sounding project, that's something that stands out on your resume.
Yeah.
As someone who has done interview recruiting both at Microsoft and elsewhere, well, actually, I'll say what at Microsoft, I'm just given the resumes when I do my interviews, and the candidates have already been picked. When I was at GE, because we were the smallest startup got acquired, when we needed to hire like co-ops, I actually had to go, I was given a stack of resumes that had already
Mhm.
been like filtered out, and then I would actually go look at that. And the thing is, when you actually review the resumes like that, that's where a lot of people would put their student projects on there, and it's really cool. But if
You
you're
need, like,
applying,
actual real world
it's
stuff.
not that you need real world stuff. It's just that if you're talking about the ways to stand out,
Mhm.
the thing is, like, this is the same project that all the computer science,
Yeah.
210
Okay.
or is it 211 students do. So it's like, oh, you did. I was like, oh, the first time I saw it, I was like, oh, that's cool. And then the second time, like, oh, this person's also done that.
Yeah.
And this person's and then it's like, oh, okay. And I'm not trying to like say that's a bad thing. That is good. Like, if you didn't have that, your resume would probably be worse.
Mhm.
But in terms of what makes you stand out, I think hackathon projects often lead to a lot more variance and
Yeah.
things.
And
that
they
can
also give
possibly
you
pop.
like a perspective in hackathon. The goal, well, depending on what hackathon you attend, the goal is to like create a product. So you have to like think about like
Yeah.
customer experience as well.
Yeah.
Whereas like if you're just like copy and pasting a project from like your class, it's just that exercise, that project.
Yeah.
Whereas like in a hackathon, or something that I have made a lot of videos on as well, is just doing projects on your own. It's like,
Oh, yeah,
forget
of course.
about your university, forget about your grades,
Yeah.
try to build stuff on your own. Not only will that like help you stand out, but you'll also have something to talk about in your interviews.
Yep.
Like you can walk the interviewer through like.
Oh yeah,
your
for sure.
process.
Definitely. That was actually the second thing I was going to talk about. The reason I talk about hackathons more is I know that personally, I found that doing things in a hackathon was more motivational for me,
Mhm.
especially when you have a group and deadlines.
Yeah.
It can be quite often quite hard and maybe even overwhelming when you're trying to do a project on your own.
Yeah.
But that's it. If you are able to do a project on your own, that's also absolutely fantastic.
Because there's also that element as well. When a hackathon, usually hackathons like they lock you in a theme.
Yep.
So it's easier to like think about stuff.
Yep.
Like when you're just on your own, like there's just so much stuff you can do. Like where do you start?
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
I believe there's also programs like is Summer of Code still a thing?
I think Google Summer of Code.
Yeah,
Talking
Google
about.
Summer
I think
of
so.
Code.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like finding something like that to contribute to an open source project. I think that the reason I would suggest something like Summer of Code as well is because I think especially if you're newer in career, it is quite intimidating to jump into an established open source code base. It's quite complicated, and I think that having that mentorship and guidance there helps. I'm trying to think what else is there for like.
I think there's a lot of companies have programs. I know Microsoft has a lot, like their Explorer internship program.
Yeah. So
and others, Meta or Facebook, like they have Meta University.
Yep.
Amazon has like Amazon interns, and then
Oh, for sure. But I
Google.
thought we were talking about like if you didn't have an internship, for instance.
Yeah. So I guess but I mean So in the internship context, there are a lot of opportunities. But even if you don't manage to get an internship, it's not the end of the world. I think,
It's not.
Yeah.
It's not the end of the world. It can feel bad,
Mm-hmm.
and it can feel overwhelming, but you have to start sometime.
Yeah.
And like it's not going to get better on its own unless you do it, but the good news is you can try and do it slowly.
Mm-hmm. But I think that another super interesting element now is that, so you mentioned when you were coming into tech, it was like that initial rise of this industry. But now, because everything's available online on YouTube, like anyone can learn how to code. So like coding itself, I think now the value of that has decreased a bit. It's more now like on your problem solving, like how you can like come up with solutions to problems.
Yeah.
I think that is now more valuable.
I would argue it's always been about that though.
Mm-hmm.
Like writing code is
like it's just a tool that you use
is
to,
a tool.
Yeah.
So because like okay, I think I remember talking about when I graduated, I didn't get some jobs initially. I actually got pretty despondent.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that actually happened was I remember like when I went into a coding interview thinking like I should use a language, I should use like one of these flavor of the week languages or something like that because I think that would be really cool. But I didn't really know what I was doing with it. I was trying to do, as I said, like I was trying to say what I thought they wanted me to say versus, being, actually, upfront honest with what I had. And I think that really got into my head and it also made me second guess things. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's a super important stuff because a lot of like I get a lot of messages, for example, on Instagram, people asking me like we have no experience, like what do we do? And my like I've done like a lot of short videos on this. Is like just use your daily life as an inspiration. Like forget university classes, anything. Say like you're just studying at home.
Yeah.
Use your daily life as an inspiration. Like you like to play games. Like make your goal of like creating say like you play Fortnite. Like make a goal of like creating a Fortnite clone. Yeah. Or just use those ideas to create projects.
I actually have a friend who's he's not in software. He's actually in mining engineering. But I remember, actually feeling kind of sad that he didn't go into software because that would have been fun for him to be in the same program as me. He's a university friend. Because what he would do is he was playing MapleStory. It's this like free online MMO, free to play MMO. And he would hack it. But like the way you would hack it is, you would modify these config files and oftentimes write like small snippets of code. And even now in industry, like that was a skill he had. But he actually had a really sour taste of, he actually did an intro computer science course at UBC, and unfortunately he did not like the instructor, and that kind of soured him off the whole thing.
Yeah, I think, that's important.
But even now, like I remember him, like when he's in the mining industry, like he has a very valuable skill set because like he knows how to do all the Excel macros, which is, a form of programming itself. He writes all these interactive like spreadsheets and things like that and changes things and optimizes. But I'm just like looking at him and I'm like, that's programming. You could have gone into software development.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing you mentioned was like being discouraged by the intro course you took.
Oh, yeah.
That's something I felt as well. Like I took, not related to computer science, but I took an astronomy course at UBC, and like that just killed my passion for astronomy. And I think that's true for a lot of people, especially students as well. They want to get into tech, but it's just they don't like find that initial spark to really get them going, and then like they just get discouraged and then they don't really pursue that opportunity.
Yeah, this is one of those things that's, I think it's a known problem. I know that I personally, I didn't talk too much about my university journey as well. I think I talked about being in COGS. One of the things that actually I really liked about computer science is my first year experience in computer science was fantastic. I had this amazing instructor, Professor Kurt Eiselt. He's not at UBC anymore. I think he's somewhere in California now. But he's as a professor, his actual focus was teaching computer science. His research area was on how to better teach computer science. And actually, as part of his research, I think if you've gone to UBC, you've probably done Computer Science 110.
Yep.
But Computer Science 110 is very different from what I did in my first year. I did Computer Science 111.
Mm-hmm.
Computer Science 111 was an intro to Java course. Computer Science 110, my understanding is it's like, it uses, what is it, Rocket?
Basic, student language, BSL,
Yeah. And so it uses more of a functional paradigm. And it's because of I think what they did is they realized that from the research that it was more important to kind of teach these fundamentals than to teach, because that's a very more mathematical way of computing, as opposed to like, the intro Java course. It wasn't necessarily as, mathematical. I actually struggled a little later with some of the algorithms courses. But like I said, because his whole focus was on teaching, he was a fantastic teacher. He was very engaging, used a lot of good examples. I later, in like my third year of university, I actually, when I was still in COGS, I did a psychology course in memory. And the way this professor was also fantastic, because he was a former high school teacher. So he also knew how to teach in addition to research. And some of the things he talked about, like some of the techniques for making things memorable, such as tying things to an event or tying things to something very memorable, like tying things to a memorable event, using humor and things like that. These were all things this professor in first year had done in computer science, and like I guess it gave me a new appreciation for that.
Yeah, I think that's especially in the student sphere, like in the student life, that's a super important element, is whether that's your teacher, professor, your mentor, or whoever's like you're looking up to for that guidance. Like they can really like change your perspective on your career. Like they can either like launch you to like be fully motivated, or like just kill that.
I would also say like not just that, but also being around. I would say that your peers also matter. Yeah. If you are around other people who are driven, motivated, care about this stuff, it is also easy to fall into that and similarly develop good habits alongside that.
Okay, well, I guess let's talk. I want to transition. I want to get your thoughts on ChatGPT and all this new AI stuff. But just before we do, I guess maybe you can just summarize like under a minute, people who want to get into tech, but they don't have access to like, say, a quality educational institute, for example. What do they do? There are some avenues, for example, like maybe you can start your answer off of this. Like there's freelance programming, for example. People can do that just to get some experience. There's contract work, which I tell a lot of people on my channel. It's like, if you don't have any opportunity, just try that. Like reach out to your family, friends. Like say, I can build a website like for you. I'll do it for free for now and then slowly. But for people in that situation, like they can't really go to like a high level institute, whether that's their like grades or just like their geographical location, whatever circumstance there are. What can they do to break into the tech industry?
I don't think I have a good answer for this. I can try to think of some things. But it is because of how competitive it is. Yeah. I mean, the best way to do it, I think everything you've said is correct. Building projects for people, building projects for yourself actually is probably one of the better ways to do it. Like if you could come up with something that you would build for yourself, no matter how small, that's like your first step. And I think when you say without access to quality education, I would argue that you may not have access to formal education, but you may have access to a lot of these free courses. So I would also start with that, but also as a caveat, just note that these courses they will only take you so far. But I think like if that's all you have access to, then that's what you got to do. And I'm sorry, but there's no way to get around this, but it's going to be harder. But it's possible, but it's not going to be easy, and it's going to take a lot of hard work. But what was that thing? Like, was it hard work beats
talent? That one?
Hard work beats talent. Like, someone who is talented but not hardworking, which I'll admit was a little bit like me in the early years of university, will get beaten by someone by talent any day of the week. By hard work any day of the week.
That's an important skill as well.
Yeah.
I guess, okay, we'll use this to transition into AI, because that times there's something really curious to talk about.
Yeah.
So ChatGPT, this thing that took the world by storm. Your reactions to it?
Oh, I will say
let's speak of it like in terms of, we'll say in like a software engineering point of view, and then we'll do just like a general,
like software engineering then societal.
Yeah.
So I think the way I view it, in my most optimistic, is that this is just a natural extension of software productivity improvements. When you think about like, I'm trying to think about how like, these days, one of the languages I use a lot is JavaScript or TypeScript. And you think about how high level a language that is and compare it to, say, the early days of programming. Like, I remember one of the stories is like, there's this game I played as a kid, Roller Coaster Tycoon. Fantastic game. Apparently that whole game was written in assembly code.
Oh my God.
Right? And people used to like do that. People would write stuff in assembly. We would write stuff in C with the method assembly. I remember like when my early university career, people were just like, oh, use Java. You don't have to manage your own memory and your own pointers. Right? This is just, I think that there have always been like a lot of things that improve developer productivity. Like even now, like you have the languages and you have all the frameworks around it, which are so automagical. They just generate all these things around it. And I think AI, in my most optimistic, AI is going to be an extension of that. Like we already have, like, if you go to your IDE, you can already create a template project, which does so many things for you. You can already find lots of sample code on the internet, and this will just maybe help you find it faster. So it's not going to necessarily steal your job. It's not going to replace you as a developer, but it will enhance your productivity.
So like and tools like CoPilot, GitHub CoPilot,
things like that. Yeah. And if you don't use these tools, and like for example, if you're just obstinate, it's possible then that's more what you should be worried about. You're not going to lose your job to AI. You're going to lose your job to a developer who uses AI.
So failing to keep up with the industry, I guess that ties into your thinking as well.
Yeah, this is my personal opinions, by the way, as an individual.
No, because I'm talking about the experience you shared at your first company. Like you're working on something that is like slowly fading away from the public eye. So keeping up with that, I think that's important. But I would argue there are some developers that can take the job. But the only developers I'm talking about are freelance people. So not like actual developers in a company working on like a proper product. But I think for freelancers, I
don't like the term being actual developer, by the way, because like freelancers are developers too.
We'll say like company developers, people who work in teams and projects. Yeah. I think for freelance developers, some category will take a hit. My thoughts, like for example, ChatGPT. A lot of people, for example, like you go on networks like Fiverr, Upwork, you can hire people. Oh, like
this type of work. So the thing is that the way I describe this is like it's a lot of boilerplate work, right? So and I think that this is where ChatGPT may not steal it, but it would possibly reduce the demand. Or like there might be a few people there who can use it very well and do things and reduce the cost of it. But then that it does push a lot of people out of the market.
So like stuff like hiring someone to create like scripts for some automation task. You can try to do that on your own with ChatGPT. Super simple. That's something I've been doing. Like I tried automating all of my descriptions for my YouTube videos.
Oh yeah.
And so now I think this we'll transition to like a societal part as well.
I know that everyone's hearing about ChatGPT and it's taken the world by storm like in the last few months, but a lot of these I think a lot of these features actually have been here and under the radar, and people actually haven't realized it. So, for instance, like, did you know like text-to-speech is built into Microsoft Word? Like, it's been there for a while. Like, I had a friend a teacher. She was a friend of mine from university, and she was like, "Hey, I wanted to, transcribe this podcast episode, like this CBC radio episode, for my class using in-class material." And I was like, "Oh, cool. I'm not sure how to do that." And I remember looking up like something like Azure Cognitive Services, use my free Azure credits and build something. And then I was like, I started looking into it, and then I was like, I'll go back to her and I was like, "Hey, do you still need this?" And she's like, "Oh no, I just found out that Microsoft Word has this built in." I'm like, "What?" It's there. These things have actually been here.
I actually didn't even know that. I just hearing it for the first time as well.
Yeah, like
I never got to that extent of that usage of Word. So
right, I didn't know. I didn't know it was there either, but apparently it is. And so, yeah.
Well, I guess, have you heard about the Chinese company, I think Baidu, that's how you pronounce it?
I've heard of them. Are they like kind of like are they equivalent of Twitter in China?
I am not sure. I think
Is it
they
a
do
social media
hardware
platform?
stuff.
Oh.
I have no idea.
I must
But
be thinking of a different company.
But they are a super
heard of
big.
them.
Yeah, they did a press release where they'll be releasing like their own Chat GPT-ish Chinese version, like like their whole infrastructure of like this type of generative language model.
Yep.
So I think, what are your thoughts on that? Like now this, and I think Microsoft also acquiring OpenAI. So this, you can almost say
did we acquire?
like,
we just had a big investment in it.
yeah, investing in
Yeah.
OpenAI. So I think, like this, I wouldn't really like this AI development race. Like, how do you foresee this playing out? Like companies developing these like killer AI models, and then some trying to compete against each other's. How do you think like this? Because I think the one immediate impact of this is like accelerated development.
Yeah.
Like when you say you have ChatGPT, you have another country's own ChatGPT-ish version.
Yep.
So now it's going to push like development, like it's going to accelerate development even more. So how do you foresee this? Like, what do you think? What's at the end of the tunnel, like as AI progresses?
I don't know, honestly, in terms of technological part. Societally, I think there's going to be a lot of legislation. And I think there needs to be. And if there isn't, that's something that needs to be talked about, because this is something that's...
and you need qualified people to do that.
Yeah. So actually, you know what? Yeah, I think the reason I want to bring up legislation is when you think about how privacy, the debates of privacy and how much companies store is happening, and how much that I feel like that stuff only really took a lot of traction in the 2010s, right? When countries actually started implementing these laws, like Europe has the GDPR and things like that, right? This is when legislation actually finally caught up to this, but like a lot of this data was already being collected for so long. So I think similarly, we're gonna have to deal. I think as a society, governments need to start coming up with legislation to properly handle AI. I don't know what the end game is in terms of like what's next in terms of technology. I'm not great at forecasting that, but what I will say is like, I think as a society we do need to legislate because, for instance, we're already starting to get into some weird areas to do with copyright and AI, right? I think that I was reading, I think, an Ars Technica article about this, but the question is who holds the copyright for AI-generated art? And that's a really curious one because it looks like the lawyers are trying to use as precedent. Do you remember this news story about a monkey taking a selfie?
No.
There was this news story where this wildlife photographer went out and then a monkey came up and like looked in the camera and pressed the button and took the photo. And this was shared and it went viral. It's a really cool image. And I think PETA sued the photographer for using the work of this monkey.
Of a monkey? Oh my God.
And I think at the end of the day, the courts ruled that copyright can only be assigned to works created by a human. And I think that they're trying to use this precedent now in because I think there are a bunch of lawsuits coming up right now.
Yeah,
I
with all these generative models, because you have like stuff like because I think I also read an article where I think CoPilot GitHub is being sued because there's like infringement of code being copied over. Yeah,
and I have no idea because like I don't know how GitHub Copilot got its code. I mean, if it's from open source sources, I don't know how that's going to work in a court of law.
So you have that world, like that programming world, then you have like all this text generation, image generation, video generation, voice generation. I think Microsoft also did, I can't remember what it was, like you give it a 3-second voice clip and then it generates like you can clone your voice essentially.
And it only needs like a set of calibration inputs. Oh wow, that's
stuff like this. I think this would be a super interesting to see how this gets monitored, and like all these privacy stuff as well. Yeah.
But I wish I had a better answer in terms of like how I see like the AI arms race going. I just honestly don't know. But I do think that governments are going to step in. I was just thinking about this as well. Like, who knows what's going to happen? Are we going to see things like? Are we going to see legislation like, you know how this CanCon here in Canada where we have to like, a certain percentage of the content on the airwaves has to be generated by, by Canadian artists, for instance?
No, I did not know.
Oh, if you didn't know that, that's why you hear like a lot of, I guess, I don't know who these days, but it was like Nickelback for a while back on the radio and things like that. I think like there's a certain percentage of airtime that needs to go to that. And I'm like, now I'm wondering, I'm like, are companies going to start having, are they going to have to start
Human
like,
airtime
yeah,
and then
humans,
AI,
humans have to create a certain percentage of content? I don't know.
AI generated songs playing on the radio.
Things like that, like, oh, how much has to be made by a human? Yeah, like,
Mm-hmm.
and actually that's what, this is also where the other part gets really interesting, is what happens about, AI assisted development of things.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the art world is a really interesting one for that too as well, because, historically, artists will take, they will look at the works of other artists
For inspiration.
learn their techniques, imitate, and then, iterate. But then, that's what ChatGPT, not ChatGPT, that's what, I don't know what the
DALL-E,
DALL-E
the
and
image
things
one,
like that. These art AIs do. They do something similar to that, but it's just that, no human actually,
They drew that, so it's
drew
all
that.
generative. It's being generated now, fresh.
But then what happens if you take, something that DALL-E generates, and then you're like, okay, it's not perfect, but then, you have some Photoshop skills and you brush it up.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, this is, I think, the reason I bring this up, it's not just for art, because like this is possibly what's happening for code as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it generates all this code for me and then I brush it up. But how is that different from, say, like, how do we compare that to, say, like, when I create an app and then there's a whole scaffolding, like, like if you've ever created a React application, if you create React app, it just builds this like very basic bare bones app for you off the top with all this generated code. Like, I think that the reason that works is because, like, I think, the creator of that provides that and officially says you can use this. But like, I
With
think
AI, it's still a great area. Like, it's new things that needs to be talked about, discovered, and so on. Yeah. So I think it's a super, super interesting space.
Yes, I think this is it's possibly one of the biggest shifts that's happening. And it's funny when you're asking, like, you're at the beginning we're talking about how do you get a job in tech, and I'm like, well, this advice only applies.
Yeah. So I think that might play into that as well. Do you think this is like this ChatGPT stuff? This is like we're at the start of like a big revolution, like I can't remember, like the newspaper printing, like that,
the printing press.
Yeah, changed everything. Like, do you think this is like that? We're here, like at that point, doorsteps of like something super.
It's quite possible.
Change.
I will say that, it's not like, again, I think ChatGPT and us talking about it is really just it hitting the mainstream, and I think part of it is like the mainstream availability of it. But I think that AI being used like this has been here longer than I think the general public has been aware of.
But I think, but that also ties into its development, because like something like ChatGPT, when you unleash it onto the world where anyone can use it, and you use that data to make it even better and better, I think that also accelerates like the development of stuff. Yeah, and I think like I know I think there's like this underlying model with OpenAI. There's like GPT, and then ChatGPT is like a subset.
ChatGPT is just a chatbot on top of the GPT language models, right? That's why it's called ChatGPT, is my understanding. I'm not sure though, because like I think it uses my understanding is it's GPT-3. So it's like the third version of this model.
iteration.
Like I said, I'm not an expert on this.
Yeah. So this is a super exciting field. I think if anything, people should now start like focusing on much more of like a mathematical background for like machine learning AI, because I think the demand for this will just skyrocket in the upcoming period. For
sure. But I will also say, like, I think it's really easy to focus on, just the technical part, the STEM part. But this comes a bit from, I think there's an AI white paper, and I remember this, like hearing this from a training about AI. But it's to do with, like, the responsible AI guidelines. And one of the things they were talking about is how, yes, people in general need to start understanding, programming and such a bit more. But at the same time, us developers, engineers, we also need to understand the humanities part more, because we need to understand what we're creating and how we're creating it. Because, I mean, if you want to quote Jurassic Park as well, too busy thinking about what you could do and whether you should not about what you should do.
You mentioned Jurassic Park. Have you heard of? I can't remember the name. So there's a company. They're now starting to do cloning. I think it's already common that you can clone your dog for about 20,000.
Cloning your pets. I have heard of that.
Yeah. So I think that's not off the possibility chart. own Jurassic World, like bringing stuff. Like there's just so much you can do.
I mean, I've heard scientists trying to bring back a woolly mammoth in 4 years. So
yeah. Yeah.
But like, but back to that, like, I think that it's not great to neglect the humanities parts of our educations, because there are societal impacts we may not even realize from the things we're doing. And I think more than ever now, we have to realize that, you know, at the end of the day, society, you know, as humans who live in human society, we need we need things that work for us as humans. We can't take out the human element. And I think it's so easy to be able to with something like tech, where you can focus on the machine part. And
well, it's also because the industry rewards that. So I think that also pushes that that development. But it is a super crazy space at the moment, especially like with these, like the popularity that this stuff is gaining. So it is, I think, not only, but I also think now with like stuff like ChatGPT, there are a lot of things that are now, I think, starting from now, I don't think we have to wait a long time for stuff to notice, but stuff like, say, generating ideas, content creation, for example, to take one.
I mean, did you see that BuzzFeed laid off, I think, 12% of staff or something, and they are going to use things like ChatGPT for things like generating listicles and things like that.
Yeah, so stuff like that, I think that will be like an immediate effect that we'll start to notice. Is now the value of like actually coming up with content, with ideas, like the value of that decreases. Now I think it's just like what input you can give it to ChatGPT. I think the value of that increases now. And
again, it's really tough, because like I also know that like I said, if I want to be the most I guess human optimistic / AI skeptic on this portion, how much of that is just an iteration on right now as an engineer, you know, looking up, being able to search the right prompts in your search engine or in Stack Overflow and things like that, right? Just like that is itself a skill, knowing what to know. Because I one of the things about ChatGPT, actually, because I actually remember I have toyed around with it, asking it to answer some simple algorithm questions, is that, you know, ChatGPT is often right, and or it's very close to right. And I think you still need someone with some, you know, you still at this point need experience to be able to like look in and identify, wait, what's real and what's not, like what because it answers fairly confidently unless you tell it not to. So I guess what this does is it helps people with domain knowledge accelerate that, because they can use it. But like the worry, I think, is that, you know, someone without the full knowledge just uses it and takes it as you know, oh, okay, it says this, so do this.
Oh yeah, doesn't work, that's right? Another interesting element as well.
So and you know, ChatGPT I think right now can only it only relies on older data, like I think it was like 2021. So sorry, I'm just rambling a little bit with this.
I think that's an important point you raised, which is that there will be a subset of the population that now like just places their trust like to whatever, because people who know stuff, what to look for, what to know, they can always question whatever's being generated. And
I think that's why it's still important to know these things, but maybe that's my bias as someone who has classical style education. Maybe it's not that important, you know. Maybe this is my version of you know, the teacher being like, you're not going to have a calculator in your pocket, and then literally have a calculator in my pocket
every time. Yeah, I know it is super interesting, super fun to talk about, and I guess you guys can let us know in the comments as well what your thoughts are. Thank you so much, Bert. It's been such an awesome conversation.
I hope I was helpful here, because like I said, I'm not sure
how much of this there was a lot helpful. Of good advice that you gave in like our first part. You also shared your experience, which I think we also touched upon some really important topics. One of them, like what your experience is like leaving a job where you feel like you're not growing, being a generalist versus a specialist. So I think we touched upon a lot of really important stuff in the tech industry, and also just like at a high level talked about like all these new tech tools that are coming. So it was such an awesome conversation.
Thanks.
And maybe we can do it again. Make sure you guys like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.